on a hot afternoon in August of 1777, the cannons of British Brigadier General Barry St. Leger opened fire on Fort Stanwix. This marked the beginning of a siege that pitched a defiant American garrison against a formidable force of British-controlled troops and their Native American allies. As the strongest patriot stronghold in the Mohawk Valley, deep in the New York frontier, the fort was the Americans' final barrier against the westernmost pincer of a British strategy designed to sever New England from the rest of the colonies. The siege of Fort Stanwix became a contest of deceit and endurance, characterized by desperate attempts to rally support on the New York frontier, brutal Native American ambushes, and an unorthodox use of psychological warfare. This is how modern historiography tells the story of the staggering siege of Fort Stanwix. By 1776, the American Revolutionary War was only 2 years old, and the Americans were already at risk of failure. The invasion of Quebec in 1775 had ended in disaster, and although the Americans forced the British to abandon Boston in March of 1776 after an 11-month siege, their victory was short-lived. In August, British forces under General William Howe returned in full strength, defeating the Americans at the Battle of Long Island and forcing them out of New York. With both Canada and the strategically vital port of New York firmly under British control, the prospects of the revolution looked bleak. As winter set in, British leadership was confident that 1777 would be the war's decisive year. Major General John Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny, devised an ambitious strategy to crush the revolution by launching a campaign from Canada. His plan called for a three-pronged pincer movement designed to sever New England, which the British considered the heart of the rebellion, from the rest of the colonies, which the British believed harbored stronger loyalist sympathies. Burgoyne would personally lead the northern pincer, commanding over 11,000 troops, as they advanced south along the Hudson River. General Howe, leading the southern pincer, was expected to march north from New York City and rendezvous with Burgoyne in Albany. Meanwhile, a third force under Barry St. Leger would incite an uprising on the frontier in what is now upstate New York, to divert as many American resources as possible from the main pincers along the Hudson. To achieve this, St. Leger was to advance from the west through the Mohawk Valley, rallying Loyalists and Native Americans, principally from the Iroquois Confederacy, before converging on Albany as well. If successful, this strategy would both strangle the revolution by leaving New England isolated and vulnerable, and convince settlers on the New York frontier, along with the powerful Iroquois Confederacy, to support the British cause. The fate of American independence was about to be decided on the edge of the New York frontier. On the New York frontier, daily life was increasingly shaped by the growing conflict that was about to engulf the region. Families and communities entered the Revolutionary era deeply divided. Some sided with the revolutionary cause, others remained loyal to the British crown, while many hoped to stay neutral. According to the military historian John Lozader, the struggle along the Mohawk, as in other frontier regions, was less a traditional revolution and more a brutal civil war. Loyalists to the British crown and patriots, American revolutionaries, often came from the same families. They found themselves bitterly opposed, first as disagreeing neighbors, then arguing in courtrooms, and eventually fighting on the battlefield. A striking example of these divided loyalties is the case of Hon Yost Schuyler, a distant relative to the famous American general and politician Philip Schuyler, and kin to Nicholas Herkimer, Brigadier General of the Tryon County Militia. Hon Yost chose a different path. Adopting Iroquois manners and clothing, he aligned himself with the Mohawks, a Native American nation allied with the British, thus siding against the American revolutionaries. Eventually, he was captured by Patriot forces in German Flats and sentenced to hang. In a twist of fate, his trial and sentencing were overseen by none other than his own relative, Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer. But Hon Yost, seemingly destined for a greater fate, wasn't due to hang for a couple more weeks. For the time being, he was spared execution and left to languish in prison. The division along the frontier was further inflamed by British intervention. The British relied on local loyalists such as Sir John Johnson, a seasoned frontiersman and son of the more famous Sir William Johnson, to rally support for their cause in the Mohawk Valley. Like Hon Yost Schuyler, Johnson had adopted many skills, customs and weapons from the Mohawk people, most obviously by wearing a scalping knife around his neck and a tomahawk on his belt. His efforts to recruit local support for the British cause in 1776 proved effective, raising alarm among the revolutionaries. In response, New York's revolutionary government sought to arrest Sir John. However, before they could capture him, he escaped to Canada, where he joined forces with General Burgoyne. Drawing on his deep knowledge of the Mohawk Valley, Sir John reinforced Burgoyne's plan to use the region as a key divisionary front, while the main British pincers advanced down the Hudson from the north and up from the south. With the strategy in place, the stage was set for the British campaign. The American revolutionaries recognized that securing the New York frontier was essential to the success of their cause. The most effective way to achieve this was by rebuilding and garrisoning Fort Stanwix, allowing them to control and defend the strategically vital Oneida Carry. This key portage linked the Atlantic to the continent's interior and was a crucial artery for trade and military movement. Small boats called bateaux traveled up the Mohawk River before briefly being carried overland at the Oneida Carry to Wood Creek, providing access to the Great Lakes and the vast interior of the continent. Though this route was not yet as significant as the Champlain-Hudson corridor, both American and British leaders understood that it had the potential to rival it in importance. Another important reason for the region's significance was that the land between the Upper Hudson and Lake Erie was home to the Iroquois Confederacy, the dominant native power in the area. The Confederacy, made up of 6 nations, were a significant military force deeply invested in the fur trade along the Mohawk River, making good relationships with them economically vital. While 3 out of the 6 nations had strong ties to the British, the Americans struggled to establish a foothold. Only the Oneidas were actively assisting the rebels. Despite these challenges, in 1777, Fort Stanwix was gradually rebuilt under the command of Colonel Peter Gansford, strengthening the patriot position in the Mohawk Valley. Meanwhile, conflicts along the frontier grew increasingly frequent and violent. In May of 1777, George Germain, the British Secretary of State for the colonies, ordered the governor of Quebec, Guy Carleton, to enlist the 6 nations to support the invasion of New York as part of Burgoyne's campaign. One of the key figures in bringing Native American support to the British cause was Joseph Brant, born Thayendanegea. Brant, one of the most well-known Native American leaders of his time, had met both King George III and George Washington. Though he was not born into a hereditary leadership role within the Iroquois Confederacy, he rose to prominence through his education, military skills, and close ties to British officials. By late May of 1777, Brant had launched a campaign of intimidation and raids in the Mohawk Valley, beginning with an attack on Unadilla. There, he forced anyone unwilling to declare loyalty to the British out of their homes and confiscated their belongings. Fear spread rapidly throughout the Mohawk Valley as he repeated the process in other settlements, strengthening British influence in the region. In an increasingly desperate attempt to keep the Iroquois neutral and deter Brant's raids, the Americans dispatched an expedition under General Nicholas Herkimer of the Tryon County Militia to negotiate with Brant near Unadilla. When Herkimer arrived, Brant bluntly advised him to turn back. To reinforce the warning, 500 of his warriors emerged from the woods, yelling and firing their muskets into the air. A clear display of force meant to show that they could have annihilated the American force had they wished. Perhaps the only reason they didn't was the personal history between Brant and Herkimer. Once neighbors, the 2 men found themselves on opposite sides of a brutal and escalating war. The American attempts to sway the Iroquois in their favor remained largely fruitless. Soon after, more than 1,000 Mohawk warriors promised rich rewards for American scalps took to the warpath for the British side. In June, Burgoyne assembled his men to move down the Hudson. At the same time, Barry St. Leger was put in charge of leading the westernmost pincer. He began moving down the St. Lawrence River to Lake Ontario, where several hundred Native Americans joined the expedition. At Oswego, they linked up with more Native Americans under Brant. Sir John Johnson was also among his men. Meanwhile, the defenders of Fort Stanwix were hastily finishing their fortifications. The fort featured formidable defenses, with 4 well-built bastions of earth several meters wide, making the fortress fairly resistant to cannon fire. A wide ditch and a low wall on the outer edge, known as the Covered Way, provided additional protection for the fort and gave the defenders a forward position to defend. You can actually visit the reconstructed fort today and experience history firsthand, whether you're heading to Fort Stanwix or halfway around the world. I highly recommend today's sponsor, Saley eSIM. They offer fast, reliable internet almost anywhere you go, at prices that are hard to beat. On average, I save around $35 to $45 by opting for their 5GB plan instead of using my local provider. Before I travel, it's easy to select a data plan on their website, download the app and activate my plan before leaving home. Once it's set up, Saley protects you from accidentally connecting to a foreign network, so you can avoid unexpected roaming charges entirely. You also skip the hassle of local SIM vendors and the risks of public Wi-Fi. Saley works both on iOS and Android devices, offers 24/7 chat support, and gives a full refund if your phone isn't eSIM compatible. Get an exclusive 15% discount on Saley data plans. Use code SandroMan at checkout. Download the Saley app or go to saley.com/SandroMan. The garrison of Fort Stanwix was short of supplies, but help was on the way, with several small boats carrying powder, food, and ammunition making their way up the Mohawk River. To slow the British advance and ensure the supplies would arrive before the enemy, the Americans felled trees into Wood Creek, rendering it impassable for boats. This forced the British to clear an alternate route by land around Oneidas Lake, significantly delaying their process. While the main British force was busy clearing the road and creek to transport their artillery and troops, Native American allies formed an advance guard to harass the Americans and prevent further supplies from reaching the fort. On Sunday, the 27th of July, 3 young girls ventured outside Fort Stanwix to pick raspberries. Lying in wait, native scouts attacked when the girls had strayed far enough from safety. 2 were shot and scalped on the spot, while the 3rd was wounded but managed to escape. The brutal attack sent a wave of terror through the fort, prompting Colonel Peter Gansford to withdraw all civilians and workers from outside the defenses. Shortly after, the race for Fort Stanwix came to a head. The supply-laden boats arrived just as St. Leger's advance party closed in. The 4 boats successfully unloaded their cargo, which was quickly brought inside the fort. But as the garrison rushed to man its posts, the boatmen who had returned to their vessels came under sudden attack. Musket fire and arrows rained down as they were chased from the river back to the fort. Despite the onslaught, most of the men managed to reach safety, though 2 were wounded, 1 was captured, and 1 went missing. St. Leger immediately set to work besieging Fort Stanwix. However, his efforts were hindered by a manpower shortage. Many of his troops were still busy clearing Wood Creek and the nearby road to transport artillery. Meanwhile, the American defenders scrambled to use what little time remained before they were completely cut off. They attempted to gather cattle, hay, and other supplies from the surrounding buildings, but their efforts were constantly disrupted by relentless Native American attacks and sniper fire from concealed positions. That same day, the 3rd of August, Brigadier General Nicholas Herkimer was already leading a double column of about 800 men marching to relieve the fort. However, his movements did not go unnoticed. Joseph Brandt's older sister, Molly Brandt, had discovered the American relief forces' approach a few days prior and swiftly sent a warning to St. Leger. Her message reached the British commander on the 3rd of August, and he quickly gathered his Native American war chiefs, Joseph Brandt, Sir John Johnson, and Colonel Butler, to discuss their next move. St. Leger's line was already stretched thin, and he couldn't afford to send men away to fight a relief force, because this would make his besieging force vulnerable to a sortie by the garrison. However, with limited options, and on the advice of his subordinates, he decided to ambush the Americans before they reached the siege lines. A ravine near the village of Oriskany was chosen as the site for the ambuscade. The stage was set for a decisive clash. On the morning of the 6th of August, the men of Tryon County Militia marched toward a site roughly 6 miles from Fort Stanwix, where the road crossed a deep, steep-banked ravine. Unbeknownst to them, a British Iroquois force lay in wait, carefully prepared for an ambush. British light infantry positioned themselves to the west, while Native American warriors formed a rough half-circle along the ravine's edge, intentionally leaving the eastern side open to lure Herkimer's men deeper into the trap. Their plan was simple, yet devastating. Once the entire American column was fully inside the ravine, the British infantry would spring the trap and halt the Americans' advance with a thunderous volley from their concealed position, while the native warriors would attack from the side and close in from behind, sealing off any escape. When the American column cautiously entered the ravine, both the Iroquois and the British saw former neighbors, friends and relatives march into their trap. The Mohawks saw the Oneida, also part of the Six Nations of the Iroquois Confederacy, on the enemy side, while the British soldiers recognized men they knew from their lives on the frontier, including former friends and neighbors, many of whom they knew by name. They all were about to become their targets. However, once the first 3 patriot battalions were in the ravine, the British Iroquois plan quickly went awry. As the American vanguard crossed a small stream, they halted to fill their canteens, still unaware of the ambush ahead. Seeing the Americans so vulnerable was an irresistible temptation for some of the more impatient and inexperienced Native American warriors, who prematurely launched an attack. A deadly musket volley ripped through the advance guard, and before the survivors could react, the warriors charged in with spears, tomahawks, and war clubs. Realizing the trap had been sprung too soon, the British and Iroquois forces hastily opened fire too. Despite the ambush not going exactly as planned, the opening volley was devastating, especially for the American officers. The survivors scrambled to form defensive lines and return fire, but the thick gun smoke further obscured the hidden attackers, and the first volley yielded little success. When the Americans reloaded their muskets, seasoned Iroquois warriors took advantage of their vulnerability and rushed ahead in swift melee assaults. The warriors who had prematurely attacked the vanguard were now using hit-and-run tactics, dashing along the American line, weaving between the opposing forces. Amid this chaos, the British had a hard time distinguishing friend from foe, and friendly fire cost many native warriors and even a couple of war chiefs their lives. As the battle raged, the 3 leading American battalions were slowly encircled, while the 4th, still outside the ravine, had yet to engage. Sensing an opportunity, Joseph Brand led his warriors against the American supply wagons, effectively cutting the force in 2. Panic seized the men of the unengaged battalion, but its commander, Colonel Vischer, managed to rally his men and establish a defensive perimeter. Meanwhile, the brigade's main body fought fiercely while forming a makeshift defensive line as well. The Oneida warriors and the 4th Battalion, who were further to the end of the ravine, eventually broke through to General Herkimer, and together they pushed away from the road to a more defensible terrain on higher ground. There, the Americans paired up and took cover behind trees, one man firing while the other reloaded, making it harder for the Iroquois warriors to overwhelm them in melee combat. As Herkimer rode along the lines encouraging his men, a musket ball struck his leg, mortally wounding him. Still, he refused to be carried off the field. Propped against his saddle, smoking his pipe, he continued to direct his troops. Only an unexpected rainstorm brought a brief pause to the battle. For several hours, both sides hunkered down, trying to keep their powder dry. By noon, the rain had subsided, and the violence resumed. The battlefield had developed into chaos. Volleys were exchanged, small groups of warriors and militiamen advanced and fell back, and as ammunition dwindled, merciless melee took over. Iroquois warriors, once allies, clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat, their tomahawks splitting the skulls of men they had once stood beside, while former frontier neighbors bludgeoned each other with clubbed muskets and drove bayonets into the flesh of old friends. A grim testament to the savagery of the Revolutionary War. In the thicket of clashing weapons, distant cannon fire echoed from Fort Stanwix at around 2 p.m. The Americans, hearing the booming shots amid the screams of battle, took it as a sign that the garrison was launching a sortie in their support. With renewed hope, Fisher's battalion finally broke through to the brigade's main body. The garrison of Fort Stanwix did indeed launch a sortie, not to directly aid Herkimer's men at Oriskany, but to strike at St. Leger's camp. The American forces stormed the British encampment, destroying buildings and making off with valuable supplies, including clothing, kettles, blankets, and provisions. Though the raid did not decisively alter the military situation in the ravine near Oriskany, it further unsettled the Iroquois warriors, who had already suffered heavy casualties during the prolonged fighting. The battle had ground to a brutal stalemate, with little left to gain. More significantly, the loss of many respected Iroquois chiefs, some to friendly fire, left their warriors demoralized and hesitant to continue. Because they also feared potential American reinforcements, their resolve began to wane. By 3 p.m., 5 grueling hours after the ambush had begun, the battle finally ended. Of the 800 Americans who had marched into the ravine, only about 150 emerged unscathed. The British side suffered over 200 casualties, most of them Iroquois warriors. To make matters worse, when the battered British and Iroquois forces finally returned to their camp, they found their provisions looted, their blankets gone, and their shelters destroyed. British and native morale was at an all-time low. Despite the setback in the Battle of Oriskany, the British cannons finally opened fire on Fort Stanwix on the 8th of August. The defenders quickly returned fire, but neither cannonade had much effect. The fort's thick walls were specially designed to withstand such bombardments, and the British had failed to bring heavy artillery. They only had 2 6-pound cannons, 2 3-pound mortars, and 4 Coehorn mortars, which were insufficient to breach the fort's formidable defenses. However, St. Leger, recognizing the flaws in his initial approach, devised a new strategy to reduce the fort. In letters to Burgoyne, he described how he converted his artillery into howitzers, versatile weapons that fall between a cannon and a mortar. They could shoot at various angles and fire either directly at a target or high into the air to drop explosive shells and incendiary materials onto defenders from above. However, for this tactic to be effective, the makeshift howitzers needed to be moved closer to the fort, as their small chambers could not hold enough powder for long-range shots. Once in range, the plan was to target the fort's magazines, hoping that a sustained bombardment would cause them to explode. To approach the fort without leaving themselves open to enemy fire, St. Leger's men began digging a sep, a zigzagging trench designed to protect them from direct cannon fire. As the sep inched forward, the men worked carefully to stay out of sight of the fort's guns. At the same time, they began digging a mine to undermine one of the fort's bastions, hoping to bring it down through a controlled collapse. As the situation at Fort Stanwix became increasingly tense, the Americans found themselves also retreating in the face of Burgoyne's main advance down the Hudson River. General Philip Schuyler had pulled back to Stillwater, struggling to reorganize his forces into a cohesive unit capable of repelling the British invasion. However, although under pressure, he did not neglect his western flank. On the 13th of August, Schuyler sent Major General Benedict Arnold to relieve Fort Stanwix. Arnold gathered nearly 1,000 men, including militia from Tryon County, as he traveled from Stillwater to Albany and Fort Dayton. With such a force, Arnold could have attacked St. Leger directly, who commanded around 1,600 men at the time. However, for some reason, Arnold hesitated. As he approached Fort Dayton, an unexpected opportunity emerged: the arrival of a prisoner. Honyost Schuyler re-entered the stage. As a white man dressed as a Mohawk and sentenced to death, Honyost, often described as a lunatic, madman, or eccentric fanatic, struck Arnold as someone who might be able to help him. Honyost's mother and brother, pleading for his innocence, arrived just in time, and it was revealed to Arnold that Honyost had a spiritual connection valued by the Mohawks, giving him significant influence over them. Arnold promised to free Honyost if he could infiltrate St. Lecher's camp and convince the native warriors that Arnold's forces were much larger than they actually were. To ensure Honyost's cooperation, Arnold kept his family as hostages until the mission was complete. To lend credibility to Honyost's story, Arnold's men shot through his clothing and arranged for an Oneida warrior to follow him at a distance and confirm the tale. Honyost entered St. Lecher's camp without difficulty and warned the natives that they were in serious danger. When asked about the size of Arnold's forces, Honyost ominously pointed to the leaves on a nearby tree. The Oneida warrior arrived shortly after, confirming his story by claiming that a talking bird had revealed that an immense enemy force was closing in on the siege camp. This caused the native warriors to begin abandoning the siege. With little progress made, no spoils yet obtained, many of their possessions taken during sorties, and heavy losses at Oriskany, the warriors' morale had all but evaporated. Whether it was Honyost's tale or simply pragmatism, more than 200 warriors abandoned the siege before St. Lecher could even convene a council of war. A letter from Daniel Klaus, the superintendent of Indian Affairs, confirms that St. Lecher also expected American reinforcements of about 1,000 to 2,000 men with field pieces. Along with the deserting native warriors, this bad news led St. Lecher to retreat to Oswego and then to Ticonderoga. Meanwhile, Arnold, unaware of the unfolding developments, was still on his way to Fort Stanwix when he received word of St. Lecher's withdrawal. He sent a detachment to pursue St. Lecher toward Oneida Lake, but redirected the rest of his forces to rejoin the American army at Saratoga. St. Lecher's arrival at Fort Ticonderoga on the 27th of September came too late to support Burgoyne effectively. By then, the British army had advanced within 24 kilometers of Albany, but Burgoyne's position was becoming untenable. With his western flank exposed and St. Lecher's retreat, Burgoyne also found himself short of about 1,000 men. At the same time, General William Howe's southern pincer never materialized, due to miscommunication with London. Instead, Howe had redirected his forces to capture Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne isolated. With few options left, Burgoyne chose to fight his way out, which led to the battles of Saratoga. On the 19th of September at Freeman's Farm, Burgoyne won a Pyrrhic victory, but on the 7th of October at Bemis Heights, he suffered a decisive defeat, resulting in the surrender of his entire army to General Gates on the 17th of October. This victory persuaded France to enter the war as an ally of the American forces, which would decisively alter the trajectory of the conflict. After the surrender, Burgoyne blamed the failure of his campaign on St. Lecher's inability to penetrate the Mohawk Valley and the lack of sufficient loyalist support. He believed that a well-timed loyalist uprising in upstate New York could have diverted enough American resources to allow either his advance or St. Lecher's to succeed. In an analysis following his defeat, Burgoyne also noted that the failure of General Howe to support him allowed Washington to redirect resources from New York City to relieve Fort Stanwix and assist at Saratoga. Meant to be the decisive year in quelling the American Revolution, 1777 turned out to be a pivotal year for the Americans instead. We hope you've enjoyed our telling of this epic siege. For more gripping stories about this period, we highly recommend The Fort, a novel of the Revolutionary War by Bernard Cornwell. A master of the historical fiction genre, Cornwell also wrote The Winter King, The Last Kingdom, and the Sharp series, which are all rich with the drama and spirit of their eras. You can explore these titles and many other book recommendations from history to military fantasy and sci-fi through the link in the description, which takes you to our Amazon page.